He's been terrific at testifying because a lot of people have said this is too much of a burden on small business. And I think the $4.75 has been a great help to answer that question. So thank you, Jim. And now Steve from AFSCME, who's done a wonderful job across the country on this issue and many other issues on behalf of workers. And thank you for coming, Jim. Steve.
Thank you, Kathleen. So I think I'm going to be to the left of a Kennedy, both physically and also in my presentation, which makes you really wonder about my own point of view. But when we look at the state retirement initiatives, I think everyone agrees, I think, to a certain degree about the problem. We discussed it in this morning's panel. I think Jim went through it very well. I mean, as a small business owner, you've got to provide a way to bring retirement security to your workforce. The workforce expects it. I mean, we do have an employment-based benefit system in this country, for better or worse, right? We might have been better off if we had a single-payer healthcare system, but we don't. We have an employment-based healthcare system, and we know it's very difficult to undo that. And we've seen even with the Affordable Care Act, which doesn't undo it, it creates all sorts of stress. We have similar types of features now going on in our retirement systems as we seek to address it on a policy basis. So we want to center this back on an employment-based system. We have Social Security in this country, and that is frankly, it's been around 80 years. It's working pretty well. It's under attack. I guess the incoming Speaker of the House doesn't like it very much. He's made that clear over the past few years, and we'll see, what kind of issues come about, politically in Washington, D.C. now that we have a new dynamic in the House of Representatives. But we know the federal government has not addressed this, and they haven't addressed it in large part because they want to maintain this as an employment-based system. So we're still trying to use that as the model. And I think when we look at these state-based retirement initiatives, we're trying to make it easier for people like Jim to offer something to the workforce. And we're trying to make something available to the workforce. But I think that we're suffering from a severe lack of creativity in how we're approaching this. And in our view, at AFSCME, we think that the idea of centering this around individual accounts is a huge mistake. We know the 401k system has failed us. It's a 35-year experiment, right? We have a full generation of experience, and we know it doesn't work. Now, we could argue it doesn't work because not enough people have participated. But that's really not the case. Even for those who've participated, it doesn't work. We know what the problems are, right? We have investment risk, and we have timing risk. We know we can solve some of those problems if we're a little bit smarter about it with pooled investments. We know we can probably solve some of it. We can't solve it all, right? I retire in March 31st, 2009. My portfolio, regardless of the pooled investment, will be valued at 40% less than if I had retired a year earlier. That's just a fact, right? Now, I did pick the nadir of the market, all right, so I'm cherry picking data. But the fact of the matter is, timing matters, and we don't have intergenerational risk transfer in any of these systems, and we're not going to have it. So timing risk and investment risk do not go away. Professional management of the portfolio is a nice thing, and we have the venture capital funds, funding these state retirement initiatives, which is a nice thing, except if you work for places like Safeway when they buy those firms and lay off workers. And if that's how we're going to build retirement security for workers, we've really got to figure out what's going on the other side. So a lot of these systems are not as durable as we may think at the state-based level if we can have individual account approaches. We still have longevity risk. And somebody had mentioned that inside the room. And that's really a fancy way of saying you can outlive your money. Or alternatively, you may deprive yourself because you're going to be concerned that you're going to outlive your money. So we have to figure out a way to annuitize, to get that lifetime stream of income. And none of these plans effectively address that to date. We have to figure out a way to do that because the commercial annuity market is too full of fees. Too much money leaks away in fees on the annuity market. We haven't figured out a way to address that yet. So that's a second huge component of this that has to be considered. We also have the fee issue, and Kathleen rightly points out that you can get some economies of scale. But the problem with individual account-based programs and relatively small contributions coming in on a monthly basis is it doesn't matter how many people you have, it's keeping track of the individual accounts. It doesn't decrease the cost doesn't decrease with scale. It's kind of a fixed cost of about $20 to $30 a year on those fees. And, you know, that may not seem like a lot, but if you've got a relatively small investor of $1,000, because we're talking a lot of these, a default contribution of 3%, that might be $1,000 or $2,000 a year. You take $30 off the top. That's a huge piece. It's 1% right there in the account maintenance fees. Now we haven't even gotten to investment management fees, which may be anywhere from 0.5 to additional point. And hopefully we'll keep that at 0.5. And that's where the economies of scale come in. And I think that's one of the most positive elements of the design of these programs. And we've seen it with the thrift savings plan for the federal employees, where we've been able to squeeze down those investment management fees. But the beauty of the TSP, the thrift savings plan for federal employees, is the employer, meaning all of us, are paying the account fees, right? So the employer as a benefit is paying that. So the employers are not seeing leakage from their accounts for the account, for just setting up the account, which is, a lot of people just ignore that fee, but it's huge. It's a huge piece of what we're talking about for most, you know, moderate earners. Now, of course, with the IRA system, we also have what I refer to and what most people refer to as leakage. It's another term. It simply refers to the fact that you spend the money on something else and not retirement. So that seems irresponsible, right? Why would you do that? Why would you spend your retirement income? Well, maybe because you're sick, or your kid is sick, or your parent is sick. So people know who Carolyn Colvin is, Commissioner of Social Security? I was at a presentation that Ms. Colvin gave about a year and a half ago. And she was talking about how she had amassed some money in deferred contribution plan, deferred compensation plan, 403B. I think she worked for the county, Montgomery County. And she talked about how she had this money, but she had to spend it on her elderly mother to care for her mother. Here is the Commissioner of Social Security, who obviously a woman of great intelligence and accomplishment, always earned a pretty decent income because she rose up through the ranks of government, and you know, not wealthy, of course, but a decent income. And she could not manage to save sufficiently without leakage from her retirement account. And now we're going to ask workers who make $35,000, $40,000 a year to do the same. They're one illness away from having to spend that. Maybe they want to put a down payment on the house. Maybe they even have the opportunity to send their kid to college. Those things are going to take priority over letting it sit in the IRA. And of course, there's tax disadvantages to doing that and penalties, but they'll suffer those penalties and that disadvantage. But the point is, will that money be there when it's needed in retirement? These are real issues that have to be solved, and we're not solving them with a lot of these state-based initiatives. And then finally, the last one I'll talk about is the, well, actually two issues I'll talk about, but I'll talk about sufficiency. I mentioned this before, but we're talking about default contribution rates of 3%. I think we're giving people a false sense of security with that. 3% doesn't even come close to what it's going to take. But we know if we require what it's going to take, which is 10 to 12%, it can't stand the political light of day, right? It just won't survive. But we may be doing some harm here by setting out 3%, even with auto escalation. We might be setting out some harm here because we need to figure out a way to get other money in the system. And then, of course, we're now trying to figure out ways to evade ERISA, despite the name of your daughter's friend, which I find
I
just
am not
amazing.
trying to figure out.
I'm not you. Not you.
I mean,
Kathleen would
well,
never do something like that. No,
I like ERISA.
and we love Kathleen. So, but I think in terms of, I mean, and we, you know, but ERISA, you know, is like the reason why Kathleen says it serves a purpose, right? It's supposed to protect workers. And so I'm not really, you know, embracing this idea that we should do workarounds so people should not have fiduciary obligations. We want people to have fiduciary obligations.
Let me, can I?
Go ahead. Yeah, interject.
First of all, nobody in the audience knows what we're talking about, Steve.
How many people know what I'm talking about? Well, a few.
Okay.
See, almost half.
Okay.
So
Okay.
for
Well,
those
then
who
let-
don't,
okay, so let me give you what I think is going to go on. What this Department of Labor will require is that the states will have fiduciary responsibilities for managing the money. They will have the same ERISA fiduciary responsibilities, whoever manages the money. whoever, the money managers will have fiduciary responsibilities. The T. Rowe Prices and the Legg Masons and the Vanguards of the world, if they manage money, they will have fiduciary responsibility. What this will do is they will take the fiduciary responsibility that would apply to a GM or a Coca-Cola off of a small employer, because the fiduciary responsibility from a small employer is is a lot, and it will take that fiduciary responsibility, except for making sure that the money from that employer gets to the plan. And I think that makes sense.
Right, but to be clear, though, Kathleen, that's what you hope the regulations say. That's not what it says now.
That's what Phyllis Borsey said she would make sure, that's what she's told me. Who knows if that will happen? But
we'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see. But I mean, again.
But just so you know, let me give you a great story about fiduciary responsibility. So I'm talking to the deputy treasurer of Utah. Utah, for those of you who don't know, which everybody does, is a Republican state. And the deputy treasurer had been in the private market for 30 years, and he was asked to come and be the deputy treasurer. And he said, oh my gosh, the defined benefit plan that I have joined has terrible protections for workers. I don't get to vest for 6 years, number one, and if I die in another 6 years, my wife gets nothing. I have been under an ERISA rule for 30 years of my life. The way they treat workers in Utah is terrible. I wish we were under ERISA.
Right. Yeah, there you go. So with all that said,
thank you.
I don't want to, I mean.
I think you raised.
Yeah, I mean, I have, as you can tell, I have some problems with the individual retirement account approach. But I don't think we can do nothing. And I think that there are real promising things that we probably can put together at a state level. And Kathleen raised one of them, and she had it up there as the multiple employer plan at MEP. It was on her slide. This is something that probably a lot of people don't know about, right? So it's a way, you can't ask folks like Jim to take on a fiduciary obligation to creating a retirement account for employees. He's got all sorts of other regulations he needs to deal with. It's a small business. He doesn't have a benefits department. He doesn't want to hire a bunch of lawyers. If we require people like him to do it, he's not going to do it. We are going to stifle business. We can't load that on to smaller businesses. It's not practical. So what a multiple employer arrangement would allow employers to form together across a geographic area, perhaps a state, and the fiduciary obligation would exist. It would be an ERISA plan, but it would exist with a board of trustees. And this is where your economies of scale come in. Yeah. Now, what Kathleen's had in her slide was that this could be a 401k plan, right? That it can also accept employer contributions. It could, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something that looks a lot more like a pension. It could be something that looks more like a cash balance plan. We don't.
Yes, which I like.
Yeah, I know you do. We don't have to get locked into this idea of individual account-based plans, because if you're doing a 401k, once again, we're in an individual account-based plans with all of those kinds of fees. So I think we need to open up our minds a little bit, be a little bit more creative about how we view this, because you can set up something that is pooled, the investments are pooled, and the money is pooled, and the accounts are nominal. They're not individual accounts in the sense that you actually have it as your own, as a bank statement. It's a nominal account like many people see in cash balance systems in the private sector or defined benefit pension plan systems. So that's one model, which I think has a lot of potential and something we should look at. Another model that I think we should look at very, very seriously is something that we have proposed and just talking about in the conceptual phrase is kind of a state-based Social Security supplement. And we've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and we really believe in Social Security. We think it's the best thing going, really. But we also think you can get better return, more bang for your buck than the Social Security system gets, because we really don't invest Social Security funds, right? You get the kind of the return on T-bills, and that's not a very robust way to build a retirement nest egg, if you will. But we have calculated that if we took 4% of payroll, and this could be split between the employer and the worker, and we require all employers and all employees in the state to participate in a state-run Social Security supplemental system, that 4% could probably provide employees in retirement income equivalent to half of their basic Social Security benefit. So if the basic Social Security benefit right now on average is about $15,000, that could kick people up to $22,500, $23,000. That's where we think we can go with 4%. And that solves a lot of these problems. We won't have the leakage. We don't have to worry about annuitization. We don't have to worry about timing and longevity risks. We don't have, so and we don't have to worry about fees. We've developed all of these workarounds. We're trying to solve all of these problems that emerge in individual account plans and 401k plans. We're developing elaborate mechanisms which are half measures at best. Now, they do serve the interest of a certain group of people to try to do it that way, and we know who they are. But they're really not serving the interests of participants. So what our union is trying to do is get people to open up the conversation a little bit wider. And let's go back and look at the things that have actually worked over time. Social Security, defined benefit pensions. They work. They're efficient. Where they haven't worked, it's because we've created problems for them intentionally, right? If you're the state of Illinois, it doesn't work, right? Because you didn't contribute to your pension fund. I mean, they're very efficient vehicles. It doesn't mean they're free. So that's really where we're headed, I think, in terms of this discussion, to try to broaden the outlines and the contours. So I'll end it there.
Thank you, Steve. And just to build on what Steve said at the end, remember when I talked about fear at the beginning? So one of the real advantages of these 25 or 30 states that are now passing legislation, it gives people a place to talk about solutions. And there are a number of solutions on the table that didn't exist before. And I have to say, when I was at this college, McKendree, for the last 3 days, we started to talk, and students were really interested. I mean, I thought, I'm going to try it out, and they were interested. So I don't think we have the final solution. I think Steve's given very good ideas, I mean, really terrific ideas, but none of them is going to go forward unless we start the conversation. And Illinois, just so you know, is the #1 state in passing legislation. None of the professors and none of the students had even heard of the legislation. So nobody knows that this is going on. I mean, nobody. When I asked the treasurer, he said less than 1%. The treasurer of California also passed legislation, less than 1% of the citizens. So this is a silent movement. Movements cannot be silent. They have to be loud. They have to be engaged. And part of this effort is to open it up so people are not like the people in Moscow when Napoleon was there, because what General Kuznetsov had to do is burn down Moscow to get them awake.
Yeah, I think, well, two things. The question was, when we talk, as she put it, when we talk about multi-employer plans, she's thinking of the Taft-Hartley plans involving like the Teamsters Central States pension funds that have had significant problems, and now about 10 months ago, Congress passed legislation allowing those plans, with the approval of the Treasury Department, to actually impair the benefits accrued by members. Basically, we've now weakened ERISA. And she says there's been significant problems over the years. You didn't say it, but there's been some problems with corruption in some of these plans and so on. So my response to that is twofold. The first is, there is a difference between multiple employer plans and multi-employer plans, as weird as that sounds. So what I'm talking about is a multiple employer plan, which is not a Taft-Hartley arrangement, which should only be created through a collective bargaining arrangement. This would be a geographic plan for all employers in a state, union and non-union alike. It would be overseen by the state. The state would be the sponsor, so we hope that would curb the idea of corruption, although we know that there's corruption in the public service as well. But we do think there'd be state oversight of significance. So that's the first piece of this. The second piece of this is that a lot of the problems we've had in the multi-employer arrangement, in other words, the unionized Taft-Hartley plans, has been because of the decline of the manufacturing sector. Employers have withdrawn and gone out of business. So if you create a plan that's more broad, right? It's not just single industry plan, but it's broader over the full spectrum of the economy in the state, we shouldn't have those kinds of problems with withdrawal and withdrawal liability that goes unpaid because a firm went out of business. So I think we need to kind of diversify to protect ourselves.
The question, and for instance, just so you know, even some Taft-Hartley plans have been extremely successful.
Most
for
have.
instance, the machinists have done very well. And why? Because they've hired as salespeople to go out and get more people into the plan. So part of it is you need good management, not a surprise. So part of the issue is, and that's one of the questions that we all are going to have to discuss, how do you set up a plan that's successful?
But I think the question is really salient from the standpoint of, say, a small business owner, right?
Can you look in, so we can record this?
Oh, I have such a big mouth to start with. I feel like amplifying it is, yeah, but the question is right on point, right? Because if somebody comes to me and says, hey, go to this website here and sign up your employees for a plan, I'm going to be worried about the confidence of that, right? What is the fiduciary management there? Is this responsible? Is it going to be there in 20 years? And so one of the aspects that I like about what we've been talking about in Maryland is there is sort of this state involvement from the perspective of putting on the board. And I feel like there's an objective third party who's involved. And so I feel that brings some confidence to it.
Yes. Why don't you step into the microphone? Then they can see your pretty face, Diane.
I'm Diane Oakley from the National Institute on Retirement Security. Some of the research that we've done, and hi, Jim, I'm going to sort of direct this at you a little bit, because when we look at what happens when we give people pensions in the DB sector, we know one of the things it does is it grows our economy. The money going to retirees generates almost $1 trillion in economic activity. And yet, when we've done some survey work at NERS, and we ask the American people, there's a retirement crisis, how are you going to deal with it? 74% of the people say, I'm going to spend less money.
Sure.
And yet we know we have an economy that's built on spending. We know
Absolutely.
A lot of that spending goes to our small businesses. And, how do we help small businesses understand that this idea of getting their employees ready for retirement is actually going to be good for them in the long term, because there'll be somebody there to go get their hair done.
Right.
There'll be somebody there to go and have food at a local restaurant, buy the things that they want to do, buy the things for their grandkids. If they don't have those resources and we're going to put them at a level just above poverty, they can't do that kind of spending. So how do we get that message to businesses?
Well, and I think you bring up a great point about sort of the short-term versus this long-term perspective, because I think you're absolutely right. In what we've seen over the last 4 decades with wage stagnation relative to inflation among employees, right? Many employees dipped into savings or leveraged their greatest asset, their homes, right, to go into debt in order to continue to patronize these businesses. But the truth is, we saw in 2008 and 2009 what that's led to. I'm sure many of you are aware of what we're looking at on the college loan debt crisis as well, if we want to talk about another crisis facing us nationally. But if folks don't have access to education, what sort of jobs are they going to get coming out, right? What's their ability to spend? So it's one of my concerns, right? Because what we often hear from industry groups or from people who purport to support the perspective of small business or business in general is sort of this hell no, any regulation is bad regulation. I think in your first task force meeting we had one of the groups stand up and they said, we're opposed to this. And Kathleen said, well, why are you opposed to it? And they said, well, we're just opposed to any regulation. So it's definitely, we need to find ways to get the message out to employers and employees, right? Because we're in this together. My business, maybe we're atypical, maybe we're not. We provide what's called a non-elective contribution to our employees for you 401k geeks. But we make our contributions to our employees regardless of whether or not they make a contribution at all. We do 5% equivalent of salary into their 401k accounts every year because the young employees that you mentioned or folks that are on the lower end of the income scale and have these other problems aren't going to participate. But the more that we can get in there early and the more that they can build on that, the better that nest egg is going to be in retirement. We've got to do a better job about reaching out to them, making it accessible and making them understand that it's important. In my perspective, it also means underpinning those other problems that keep them from participating, like Steve was talking about.
Great. So we have one, is that one question? Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
One of the advantages to a statewide plan is the portability of it, where you can move from one job to another. Because if it's an industry.
Are you going to, if you're going to give a long talk, you have to do it in front of the microphone.
Okay, well, I'm actually not going to give a long talk. I'm going to ask a question.
Oh.
But that is one of the advantages, so that you can move from one job to another. But you are limited to, if it's a defined benefit model, which is a terrific model, because now that I'm retired and I'm getting a defined benefit check, I can tell you it's the best thing since sliced bread. But I think that cash balance plans may be more portable from one state to another, let's say, because it can be converted into other plans more readily than a DB plan. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what a cash balance plan is as related to a DB plan.
Sure. So the question, if for those of you that may not have heard it, was related to portability. How do we create portability in these systems? A defined benefit plan provides great benefits, but the portability is limited. One of the attributes of defined contribution plans is that they are portable. So the question then is, well, how about these cash balance plans, which are kind of a hybrid between a defined benefit and defined contribution plans, and what is it, and how can that address that issue? So a cash balance plan essentially is really more like a defined benefit plan from a tax code standpoint and a technical standpoint. But putting that aside, it consists of two major things. The first is employees have a pay credit each year that goes into an account, if you will. Now, it's not technically an individual account like a 401k or an IRA. It's a notional account. So you have a pay credit. So in other words, by that I mean if you make $50,000, you may get a pay credit of 7% of your $50,000 or $3,500 a year. And that goes into your notional account, just like a 401k. Now, in addition to that, by the terms of the plan itself, you will have an interest credit that is applied each year. So our interest credit could be 7% per year. So the $3,500 would then earn 7% a year in interest going forward. Or it could be some other rate that could fluctuate based on the earnings of the fund. The investments of the fund, and this is where it looks a lot like a defined benefit plan, are just like a defined benefit plan. It's a large pool of capital that's invested by professional money managers. So it combines some of the best features of a DB plan with some of the best features of a 401k plan in terms of portability. And one of the beauties of a cash balance plan is then you could offer somebody, when it's time for them to retire, an annuity that is funded from the plan itself. So you can give them that lifetime payout of capital.
That is great. We don't use the word annuity. We can use a lifetime income strain, because an annuity is what insurance companies give. This is what I learned on the first day as chairman of the task force.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all coming, and that's the end of this.